Right, folks, may I have your attention? Let's settle down. This is the first of our 5 plenary lectures this summer. There'll be one every Friday. Oops, not every Friday. In the week of July 13, it turns out our speaker can only make it on the 12th, so that one week it'll be on a Thursday, but otherwise it'll be Fridays. And the hope with these talks is that we talk about things not exactly on what we're working on, but things around it, things that are important to think about to broaden our minds. And in that spirit, today's lecture is a little bit different from the usual fare that you're used to. Now, ethics and morality and principles are not new to engineering. You can, at least my recollection of my thinking about it goes back to things like, weapons of war, those who tried to build the atomic bomb, and these days people talk about killer drones and things like that. But those are sort of extreme cases. Ethics sort of interact with engineering, even mundane day-to-day things. And of course, all engineering schools think about it. Our school has been thinking about it a little bit more intensely as well recently, and in that process we are trying to put together a curriculum that makes sense for engineering but covers all the basics of ethics and principles and building engineered systems. And in that context, I ran into our speaker today, Professor Debra Mathews, and she and Professor Feeling Gaban, who's sitting back there, and Israel Gannett, who's not here, they've been talking, and the School of Engineering has been working with her. So who is she? Let me first do a personal introduction and then do a more professional one. So when I was in grad school, one of my best friends was Minoti Parulekar, so that's a grad school connection. She has a brother, Rahul Parulekar, who when he was in high school in Bombay was classmates with somebody called Nitya Kichlu. Now, Nitya Kichlu came to Caltech and then went to MIT, did a PhD in topology. And while he was doing his PhD in topology, which in mathematics is considered part of algebra, there was another algebraist working with him called Lior Pachter. And Lior was doing computational biology. And then Lior went to a computational genomics conference and met Debra Mathews. So when Debra came to Hopkins, it so happened that Neetu had just arrived at Hopkins, and I was already at Hopkins. So from Sanjeev ... Neetu ... Debra. So that's how we know each other since at least 2003, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
It's a long time. I can tell you other fun stuff about Debra, including things like how she often gets mistaken for an undergrad even today on campus. But let's not do that. Let's get to the more serious stuff. So she is, her home is the Berman Institute for Bioethics, which is a interdivisional center, the institute that has been set up. It started off with someone called Ruth Fadden in the School of Medicine, but it has faculty from medicine, from the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, from the School of Public Health, and interestingly also the School of Advanced International Studies. So it's an interdivisional institute at Hopkins. So there she is the assistant director for science policy. Even when she came to Hopkins first, she was doing genomics, but she always thought about the societal impacts of all these new science that we develop. And so the Berman Institute was a natural place for her to come to. In addition to that, she's also associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics, and she is affiliated with the Institute for Genomics Medicine. And she'll talk to us today about the ethics of AI and in healthcare and beyond healthcare. Debra?
Good morning. Thank you very much for the kind of introduction. We have known each other for quite some time now. And my original connection did come through this connection in genetics. My PhD is in human genetics, but I also have a master's in bioethics and health policy. And all of my work until very recently was in ethics and policy related to emerging biomedical technologies. So genetics, stem cell science, neuroscience, synthetic biology, that sort of thing. And I was just saying to Sanjeev, if I'd been able to come and talk to this group last year, I probably would have talked about CRISPR and genomics and human germline genetic modification. But in the last year, I've become part of this new project, which is a bit afield for me. I am not a roboticist. I am not an engineer, though I'm married to one and I'm the daughter of one. But I'm a geneticist, so I come at this topic from looking at it as another emerging biotechnology. It's biotechnology in certain contexts, not in others. But new technologies come with similar sort of sets of issues. There are lots of overlapping issues with other areas I work on, and I'll talk a bit about that. So, lots of people, when they think of AI, they think of these sorts of things. We started with Frankenstein, it's sort of the original robot in a lot of ways. Terminator, etc., the Roomba. None of these are really healthcare related, although in weeks like this you might think of a cat on a Roomba as a sort of self-care. More recently, and I think closer to the sorts of things people in this room work on, is this very recent example of AI. So this was the announcement of, at the Google Developers Conference, of this female bot that's supposed to be an assistant and can call and make appointments for you, et cetera. And the demonstration project was this bot calling and making an appointment without disclosing the fact that it was a bot, and introducing all sorts of like ums and ahs, verbal pauses, to trick the other person that it was having a conversation with into thinking it was human. So a very sort of deceptive demonstration of AI. Well, we've been thinking about ethical issues like deception in AI for centuries. So there are, of course, centuries of philosophical thought about sort of human thought as computable and as machines as human-like. Mary Shelley certainly talked about or raised ethical issues in human construction of an artificial intelligence. Isaac Asimov, obviously, in I, Robot. I put Eliza in there for you guys. 2001, A Space Odyssey, also obviously a real touchstone for lots of people in thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence. More recently, Eugene Goostman, and, oh, sorry, I was a slide behind myself. Eugene Goostman, and sort of really starting to think about the ethics issues of doing this, because we are now at a point where the rubber is sort of hitting the road. And we've been hypothesizing about the ethical implications of this science, as I said, for centuries, but now we're doing it. So we actually have to solve some of these problems, or at least start to think through how we might mitigate the negative effects of this science and maximize the positive benefits of this science. So what are the sorts of things that, sorts of applications that AI has in healthcare thus far? So largely, the focus largely has been on a few disease types for obvious reasons. These are very serious health problems, right? Cancer, neurologic disease, and cardiac disease, in multiple different sort of places in the healthcare system, from screening to diagnosis, treatment recommendations, through prognosis. So can we detect a signal that suggests you might have cancer? Can we take that lesion and identify what type of cancer it is, or a skin lesion? Is it in fact cancer? Treatment recommendations. What are the best treatment options given what the algorithm has determined about your kind of disease? So this is sort of an AI application to personalized medicine. There are a lot of similarities here to work being done in genomics, which of course is my native land, in terms of looking at incredibly large data sets and trying to identify small signals in associations between genomic data and phenotypic data, or in the case of electronic medical records, particular pieces of structured or unstructured data and ultimate disease diagnosis, prognosis, etc. A huge amount of work has been done in image interpretation, both in sort of 2D images like X-rays, but also in much more complex kinds of image data. Medical record analysis, of course, electronic medical records insofar as they are computable. This is a big problem in genomics because oftentimes genomic data turns up in an EMR as a faxed report, which is much less useful as a form of data than other kinds of data. In addition, in many EMRs, most EMRs, there's no place to put pedigree. So this is sort of your family history of disease, when you're talking about genetic disease, who had what disease, when were they diagnosed, when did they die. That basic kind of information is critical to genetic diagnosis and is almost completely absent in electronic medical records. And the record analysis includes, of course, the narrative portions. So again, what I take you all to be working on, right, natural language processing and trying to take that unstructured data and turn it into something that we can actually use. Of course, this comes with problems, which I'll get to in just a minute, which is we are the ones putting the narrative data in there, and we kind of suck. So, so identifying, just like with the genomic data, right, you're looking for associations in that electronic medical record with markers of disease, et cetera. And just to give you an example of this, not an AI example, but an example, sort of analog example. I have a colleague who works on genetic bone disease. And she figured out that in her patient population, there was a threshold, I think it was a phosphatase level, that below that level, they had a high probability of serious disease that's completely treatable. And so she went into the EMRs and looked for other people with phosphatase levels below that threshold, and was able to identify that those were people that were very highly likely to have a disease they didn't know they had. It's one of these silent diseases. You don't know that you have it until it's too late. So now she has this issue. I looked at these people's medical records. I think they probably have this disease. They don't know me from Adam. What do I do? Now think about that on the level of all the EMRs at Hopkins, all EMRs within the Hopkins system, which is a global medical system, all EMRs across the US, if we could, if one medical record system could talk to another, which is another issue that we have. Public health applications related to identifying and predicting disease and disease outbreaks, right? There was this recent story about looking at being able to predict from individuals' search histories and the timeline of the development of their search histories that they were very likely to soon be diagnosed with colon cancer. And flu outbreaks, right? We've heard this for multiple flu seasons now, right? That flu, or in some cases, in some locations, Ebola, other diseases are predictable, identifiable early in the development of an outbreak. Prediction of disease progression and the assignment of treatment. So there's evidence that we can look at that autonomous systems can identify who among breast cancer patients is likely to benefit from certain treatments and who isn't. When these treatments come with serious morbidity, right, you might want to identify only those folks who are truly going to benefit from that treatment to receive it. Diagnosis and treatment development through literature analysis. So again, this is precision medicine, looking for signal that will help us identify disease, predict and diagnose disease, and hopefully develop new treatments. And then, much less interesting to me, payment and claims management and the whole business side of healthcare. Just a very small, yes, please.
Actually, when you say that's not of interest, I wonder whether, I mean, I also find it more boring, but I wonder whether the payment and claims stuff has been gamed in order to increase payments to hospitals, and so whether there's a sort of a clinical side to correcting the diagnosis.
I have
correcting
zero data on that, also zero doubt that it's happening. I mean, I am confident that hospitals are gaming the system in order to maximize profits where they can. In this country, I don't know about other countries that have, if I may say, more reasonable healthcare systems. But the incentive structures in the US in particular are very screwed up around healthcare. So again, I don't have data. I would hypothesize that is absolutely happening.
So there are some interesting ways in which this interacts with the other
to be
things.
Sure. To be sure, I didn't mean
through
to
the mechanism
but
design.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just I have much more experience and expertise around diagnosis than I do around business ethics. Just a very small set of applications of AI beyond healthcare, right? Expert systems have been around for a very long time now, and are used across multiple arenas. Speech recognition, obviously also available or applicable across many fields. Data analytics, autonomous vehicles, which is what we have spent a lot of time talking about lately in terms of AI. Marketing, again, and I'm going to come back to this, the scale of this is just so much larger than what has been the case in the past. I mean, already on Facebook, where I don't talk about work that much on Facebook, it's mostly like personal and political stuff. But I get ads for 23andMe, which is a direct-to-consumer genetics testing company. I get ads for CRISPR technique and services, which is genome editing, on my Facebook page all the time. So very, very good, precise marketing. Entertainment, the very recently here serious concerns about deepfakes, right? The manipulation of video to create not just audio that looks real but is fabricated, but also video that is fabricated, and then military applications, which despite the fact that I'm going to tell you about a project that I'm doing with the Applied Physics Lab, which has tons of DARPA funding, et cetera, I stay as far away as possible from military stuff because the context is so very different than civilian endeavors. So I'm going to put that to the side, even though that's a huge area of research with regard to AI. So there are, of course, huge challenges with AI. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, I think many of them, in fact, overlap with other areas, other emerging technologies, and other human endeavor that we have grappled with for a very long time. But not all of the issues do. So encoding morality, right? Thinking about putting morality into autonomous systems is something we have not done before. I just mentioned the scale and pervasiveness of this technology, and I would actually add to that the lack of transparency, right? These systems are all around us and integrated into our lives already in ways that we're not aware of. The recapitulation of human biases and flaws, which I will come back to, I think this is both a new issue and an old issue. Right? As I mentioned before, the application in healthcare that is looking at, in particular, the narrative portions of electronic medical records. I mentioned that we are not the best, perhaps, reporter on other people. We know that physicians are human and humans are biased. And that little narrative piece that whether it's about like the first introduction, she, Miss Mathews was well kept and cheerful and engaged in conversation with me, versus someone that doesn't look like the doc, doesn't come from the same class as the doc, and how that person would be described, we know is very different, right? Docs have biases against people of other races. Docs have biases against people who are obese. And that affects, and many other ways in which we suck, and that affects what gets written in that narrative piece, which is the data set you all are then going to use. And black box reasoning, right? The lack of justification for the decision made. I mean, we know from neuroscience that humans often make sort of gut decisions and then come up with post facto justification for what we decided. So we're not good at it either, but we are agents and we have moral responsibility. And even if I've made a decision and then come up with my justification, I'm held responsible for that. And in autonomous systems that are making decisions about diagnosis or treatment or prognosis, frequently that justification isn't there. The data went in, the answer came out, and what happened in the middle, we don't have an explanation for that. And I think that is new here. It's something that we have to grapple with in a way that we haven't had to grapple with in other areas of emerging technology. In contrast, I think there are lots and lots of issues that overlap with other areas. So the need, I would argue, this is a claim, to harness the technology to enhance human well-being, right? As opposed to, for example, enhancing the bottom line of large multinational companies. The lack of transparency. This is not the only place where that happens, right? Pharma, large pharmaceutical companies that are developing drugs, there's a tremendous lack of transparency. Lots of areas of science where, scientists, and I love them, are not great about communicating their science to others. Some of them are fantastic at it, but it's certainly not something that we get training in. And it leads to a tremendous lack of transparency. Job loss and displacement, this is also not new. Very recent examples. Right here in Baltimore, I live down on St. Paul Street. I used to be able to walk out my front door and catch a cab within 5 minutes. I cannot do that anymore because of Uber and Lyft. The number of cabs in the city has gone down so dramatically that I can't, there's been a tremendous amount of job displacement. So that's not new here, right? If there are autonomous vehicles that are cabs, which, there are already trials of this, or probably one of the very first places would be long-haul trucking. This is a tremendously stable job for many, many people in this country, and it is very likely to go away as a form of employment. Issues with justice, right? Justice in new technology. It is always the case in biomedicine and in most places that new technologies are available to rich folks first, right? Which often means rich white folks first. And this technology is going to be the same. There has been, for example, phones have become very pervasive in a way that I don't think was entirely anticipated. Do you have another question? Okay. With regard to electronic medical records, to give an example, again, what goes into the narrative portions or judgments that are made about individuals are made by biased agents. And not everything that's relevant to that patient's treatment is necessarily captured in the electronic medical record, right? Perhaps this person has diabetes. It's uncontrolled diabetes. And all the people like this person, the algorithm says, do very poorly on treatment. They're, for whatever reason, they're non-compliant or they just do poorly on treatment. And so they're pushed to one treatment versus perhaps a less expensive, less efficacious treatment than another because we know that they're not going to do well. But all of those people may, for example, live in food deserts where they can't get access to fresh vegetables and healthy foods, right? Then that system, that autonomous system, is merely compounding an existing injustice on that person. Autonomous vehicles, right? They have all been trained in very controlled, well-structured environments, right? With lines on the road and functional streetlights and compliant pedestrians for the most part. They have not been trained in parts of cities that are not as well structured, that are not as well maintained, right? So currently we have taxis that won't go into bad parts of town because the driver is concerned about their safety. Now you're going to have autonomous vehicles that won't go into bad parts of town because they can't function in them, because they weren't trained in that environment, and so can't go there. Again, compounding existing injustices. I already mentioned recapitulation of human biases and flaws. This is, and I put it both in the new issue and here. I think about this as sort of, have you ever seen that meme that's like, coffee, do stupid things faster with more energy? Like, that's this problem here, right? Like, we can be more awful faster to more people with AI. And we have to be very careful about sort of magnifying the ways in which we're already bad. Impact in the context of healthcare in particular, the impact on the therapeutic alliance, right? This relationship that you have with your doc that allows you to share very private information with them and trust that they will make the best decisions possible on your behalf. This is already being degraded because we now have 10-minute appointments for which the doc is an hour and a half late, right? But if you add to that, that the first part of your appointment is with an autonomous system as opposed to a doc, and then you see your doc for even less, or you're not convinced, your doc is not making the decision. The autonomous system is. That's going to further erode that relationship. Dual use is also an issue both in AI and across other areas of science. So I also work in synthetic biology, where dual use, the idea that a technology can be used for both good and bad or nefarious purposes, is sort of the main issue we think about in synthetic biology, right? This is why I have a friend in the FBI Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. Because he knows everyone doing synthetic biology. Because synthetic biology, I think in a lot of ways like AI, is a highly distributed, decentralized technology with a small footprint that you can do in your garage, right? You don't need a nuclear reactor to make fuel to cause serious destruction. And AI has already killed people, right? AI has shut down energy systems and I'm losing my words. AI has shut down electrical grids that has probably killed people who are dependent on electronic devices. AI can be used both for health promotion, as an example in the healthcare space, or for discrimination. Or in the context of the project that I'll talk about in just a minute, if we're able to get autonomous systems to identify suffering in others, to try to prevent or ameliorate suffering in others. It could also be used to impose suffering on others, right?
In fact, the first systems will probably have a sign error because there's a lot of them.
We'll probably have a what?
If there's a sign error, they might just get that wrong by mistake. That's it.
Great, thanks. Make me feel so much better. Data sharing and the data economy. So these data are about us, right? Systems are being trained on our data, be it in medical systems or social media. And these data can be shared without our knowledge. These data can be shared across borders. Excuse me. We did a project where we talked to patients at Hopkins about the use of their tissues, tissues that came out during necessary surgery, right? So the tissue coming out caused no harm to the individuals whatsoever. But once that tissue is out, what's it okay to do with those tissues? And one of the things that our focus group participants brought up that we did not raise for them was, well, I'm okay for lots of uses here at Hopkins or here in the US, but I don't want it to go overseas because I'm not confident that the governance systems in place in other countries would protect me in the same way as the systems in the US would. The same is true of these data, right? Tons of people are sending their genomic sequencing to BGI, which is in China. And in genomics, I can't tell you anything about the meaning of your genome unless I have lots of data from lots of people that allows me to draw those connections between genotype and traits. So whoever has the most data has the most power to diagnose and develop treatments. And that has a big impact on both health and potentially on economies. Concerns about privacy, again, these are our data that are being used. Incidental findings, so I mentioned that the prediction from search history of colon cancer diagnosis, right? That's an incidental finding, right? We have now learned something about you that you didn't know that we were learning and that you don't expect to hear from us about. This has been happening for a very long time in radiology, right? You go into an MRI, Hopkins undergrad wants the $50, so does the MRI for the study on decision making, and it turns out they have a mass in their brain. Incidental finding. In genomics, if I'm sequencing your whole genome because I want to find out, because I'm studying a disease that runs in your family, but perhaps not in you, but I'm looking at your whole entire genome. So I can see all the genes. I can tell if you have a particularly bad mutation in the breast cancer gene, or if you have a Huntington's disease mutation, which is a terrible disease that's like a combination of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So you went into that study for one thing, or perhaps you didn't even know your data were in the study, and now I have this very serious medical information about you. Same situation here. Informed consent. So are we getting to make decisions about what kinds of research is happening, research or product development for that matter, is happening with our data? Deception, which I brought up very early. And the impact of early public failure, right? We've seen this in biomedicine multiple times. So the first one was in gene therapy. So the idea that you can modify genes and put in corrected genes to correct disease. Very early on, there was a trial, a very, very public trial, because it's new sexy technology, right? So everybody's watching it. Kids with an autoimmune disorder were given a gene therapy that helped the autoimmune disorder and gave them cancer. That submarined the field of gene therapy for 10 years, right? More recently, we've had similar experiences in regenerative medicine, stem cell science. where we have, I call them scam cell clinics, clinics that are very willing to inject you with something they're calling a stem cell therapy for lots of money, and they're giving people tumors. So an early public failure in AI will do serious damage to the field. So what kinds of rules or guidelines do we have? Of course, we have Asimov, right? You probably all can recite these in your sleep. And more recently, of course, there have been many initiatives that have started to think, as I said, now that the rubber has hit the road, started to think very concretely about what do we do, how do we think about ethics in this new, now that we have AI and are deploying AI. I'll talk a bit more about a couple of these. So the partnership on AI includes, I mean, you're probably all familiar with this. I don't know.
I don't think we've ever seen it put down on paper. We think about it.
You think about it?
At least I haven't.
So the partnership on AI was started by all the big names, right? Google, Facebook, Amazon. Also involved are some of the others on this list. The Future of Humanity Institute, the Future of Life Institute, DeepMind, but also places like the Hastings Center, which is sort of the original bioethics think tank in New York, and the ACLU, and Human Rights Watch. So it's a really interesting global collaborative effort around maximizing benefits and minimizing harm of AI. Just a few, I'm not going to read through all this, but I just wanted to point out some of what they say. So educating and listening, right? This isn't, and we have dealt with this in science forever. It's not just about telling people what you're doing. It's also about listening to folks about how they want it to be used. Right? I always say in science, as a scientist, I can tell you whether we can do something, and if it's safe. Should we do it is not a question for me to answer as a scientist, right? It is a societal question that we need to have, we need to take together. They talk about ethics, ethical, legal, and social implications, which is language that came straight out of the Human Genome Project. Engaged and accountable to a broad set of stakeholders. They're trying to be very inclusive. I don't know how successful they're being, right? These are mostly Western folks with lots of power. Making sure that AI is deployed in a way that is accountable to and benefits folks not in the West, not in the most developed countries, I think will be a tremendous challenge. There was in last January, I think, at Asilomar, which is also resonant with my other life because it was the birth, or it was held at Asilomar, which was the home of the very first conference where biological scientists sort of said, okay, we have a new technology, which was recombinant DNA. It has risks we're not sure about. We need to pause and think about what we're doing and how we should move forward. So this conference released afterward a sort of statement of principles, also focused on maximizing benefit and minimizing harm. And brings up many of the sort of issues that I've already discussed. Value alignment, I like that language. I think it's very useful in terms of the goals and behaviors that align with human values, right? It's AI in service of our values, not AI in service of itself, more as a tool than as a truly autonomous thing, which I'll come back to in just a second. So in the last little bit of my talk, I'm going to talk about the project that I'm working on that's trying to address just a very small piece of this. I mean, these projects have been global and high level. And we are trying to do a very small piece of on a project level. It's small in part because it's funded by the Hopkins Practical Ethics funding mechanism, and we have 1 year of funding, and APL has robots, and those are expensive. So there's only so much we can do. But the focus of our project is implementing value-driven behavior in autonomous systems. These are my collaborators. So at APL, Dave Handelman, Ariel Greenberg, Bruce Sweat, and Julie Marble. And at the Berman Institute, Travis Reeder, who is a philosopher by training, and myself. The goals of our project are to develop an ethical framework for dexterous robots. So they have this robot called Robo-Sally, which is basically just a set of arms attached to a platform, but it will be more than that in the future. But that's the robot we're actually working with. So we want to develop a framework and then implement that in Robo-Sally.
This one's the one that moves, right? It's on wheels, isn't it?
They do have wheels for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It can move around and it has 2 arms.
And it has 2 arms, and you can say, you know, Robo-Sally, move here, pick that up, do all these things. Yep.
So to me, it looks like one of these centaur-like things, which has wheels and then the thing has 2 arms and eyes.
Assess the framework's impact on the robot's behavior, and then derive design guidelines and best practices. So more conceptually, we have these 3 components: the robotics, moral psychology and cognitive science, and moral philosophy. Thinking, writing, and at least as far as Travis and I are concerned, magic. I am not at all really involved in the robotics part, but rather in the moral psychology, cognitive science, sort of norms and values space, and the moral philosophy space. And we're using these 3 examples. One of an elder care assistant, so a case where a robot would be assisting an elderly person in activities of daily living. So not a companion, which I think is much more problematic, but an assistant. And we're using examples such as handing a knife. So there are threatening ways to hand a knife to someone and less threatening ways to hand a knife to someone. Can we figure a way to, through top-down and bottom-up learning, some other way to know that you shouldn't rapidly stab a knife at someone as a way to get it to them? A very different kind of, so that's a potential harm, and I'll come back to harm in just a second, right? So that's a potential harm, both if you actually stab the person you're supposed to be caring for, but also just the threat of doing it the wrong way. If you have an elderly woman and she wants to go out and is the sort of woman who feels she needs lipstick to feel like to put on her face, and the robot was assisting with that. If the robot did that very poorly, that would be a kind of harm too, right? That would be a dignitary harm for this woman to go out into the world with red lipstick all over her face, right? People would laugh at her. She would be embarrassed. She would be mortified. And that's an important kind of harm too. The second case is telemedicine, where you have a patient remote and a robot with them, and the robot is manipulating that person to help the doc, who's states or countries away, diagnose and develop a treatment plan. And then triage following natural disaster. Not, again, staying away from military triage, because it's a very, very different thing. So in telemedicine, ensuring that that robot, again, is not harming the patient on the other end. The kind of harm in telemedicine or triage is very different, potentially, than the kind of harm that would exist in the elder care robot, right? In triage, in particular, you might want to cut into somebody. Like that might be the thing that helps. So thrusting a knife at a human body is actually the intention as opposed to a threat. So the kinds of harms in these different contexts are very different. What kind of autonomy are we thinking about? So there are different kinds or levels of autonomy, right? And they require different ethics. Chainsaws are a kind of tool, as are Roombas, but the ethics that we think about when we think of the ethics of Roombas is very different than the ethics of Asimov level robots, right? And is also very different from full autonomy. Autonomy, chainsaws are sort of uninteresting from an autonomy perspective, right? The ethics there are about the humans who designed it and is it safe and that sort of thing. Unless you're talking about, what was the movie where the guy puts the chainsaw on his arm and Evil Dead, thank you, whoever said that, yes. There we might be that might be closer to the kinds of autonomous ethics we're talking about. Asimov, that's the ethics that attend to Asimov's robots are quite different, and in fact, potentially very problematic, because there you're talking about almost full autonomy, constrained, or you might say enslaved full autonomy. I haven't seen Westworld, but I've read about Westworld and heard about Westworld. I think Westworld is much closer to Asimov's robots than sort of full autonomous robots. And the problem with full, like true autonomous general intelligence, true autonomy, is that then we don't get a say anyway, right? Because then we have effectively created a new species. And to control that would be to enslave that species, right? What we are working with then, because chainsaws are uninteresting, and robots and Westworld are morally problematic, and by the way, we're like nowhere close to it anyway. We're working in our project in the middle space, in sort of semi-autonomous machines. And in thinking about how to think about the ethics of semi-autonomous machines, you can think of these two axes, and this slide and this sort of arrangement, way of thinking about these ideas are from Travis. There's true ethical theory, right? Are we going to imbue these new things with the right moral answer? Which, by the way, we've been arguing about for hundreds and hundreds of years and have never come up with the right answer, come up with an answer. Or are we talking about democratic values? And are we talking about encoding hard limits or teaching virtue? You know, kids are somewhere down here, right? I have 2 kids. I am trying to teach them to be the best possible humans I can. But ultimately, and in some cases already, I have no control over them, right? They are their own people. And again, full autonomy would be like people. That would be the definition of full autonomy. Would be just like one of us. Our recommendation, or our proposal, is that for semi-autonomous machines, what we're really talking about is democratic values, which is good because that's a space that I actually can work in. And to start, and I sort of forecast or telegraphed this before, we're starting with one ethical principle, which is do no harm, straight out of healthcare, right? And which is why I was talking about the kinds of harm in technology for different contexts. And those harms are going to be informed by the stakeholders in those contexts. So we have to identify who are the people in that context, what are their values and norms, and what would constitute harm in those narrow contexts. So that's the project we're working on. We're about halfway through. Hopefully we'll have a paper by the end of the summer. We'll see. But for the field generally, this is my last slide, I would suggest that the next step, sort of what the field generally needs to be thinking about, and here's where I come back to education, right? So, and this is true in science too. This is my modest goal in science, is to get bench scientists to look up from the lab bench and see the impact of their science on the world around them. I think that's step one. And in lots of science, in particular in places like synthetic biology, where they never touch a human, right? They're working in other organisms or in tissue samples only. They don't have any opportunity or training to think about the implications of their science out in the world. They just don't. I mean, they get don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, both in elementary school and in their... And what happens when that science goes out in the world? Who's that going to impact? How is it going to impact them? I think we need to change how we're training engineers and the folks who are going to be going into this field and leading this field. And the project that you mentioned before with Phelan, who's at the back of the room, and Israel Ganat, it is the first practical ethics grant that developed an online course for anyone across many fields in ethical decision making. So how do we identify when we're faced with an ethical issue? How do we think about gathering information about it, and how do we make decisions? And I think that's training that engineers and anybody interested or working in AI needs to consider. We need to consider what governance is going to look like. And again, some of these initiatives are already doing that. Partnership on AI certainly is. How are we going to govern this technology? Because this isn't something that we're all going to be able to agree rules about. It's just not. I don't think there's much of anything that we can agree on. So at the global level, like partnership on AI, sort of these agreements that we will do our best as companies, as organizations, to abide by a set of shared norms. This can happen at the level of global and national research consortia, right? So again, I'm on this project, this international project to develop a yeast with an entirely synthetic genome. I think there are like 8 countries involved, and we have a statement of principles, an agreement that despite the fact that we all work in different countries and with different sort of sets of norms, that we're all going to abide by these certain sets of principles. And then at the level of local projects and collaborations, where there can be true engagement with people who will be directly impacted. Right, so here in Baltimore, that could have happened prior to the drone that was observing all of Baltimore and sending those pictures to law enforcement. But that engagement could have happened, but didn't. But projects at that level where the stakeholders are very readily identifiable and reachable, and you can have conversations with them about how they might want a technology used. And most importantly, we're going to have to figure out who decides all this and how we're going to decide all this, right? Because for local projects, you can do that engagement, and that engagement can influence how that project looks. It's much harder at a national level. We are bad at public engagement, and we have no way to take whatever the product of that public engagement process is and input it into policymaking. When governments are doing it, when large corporations are doing it. So, remains to be solved. Thank you very much.
We have plenty of time for discussion, comments, and so on and so forth, so please get started. Who wants to go first? Jason.
If somebody else wants to go first, I already asked them.
You can start it up. You can break the ice.
All right. So first of all, thanks for this great survey. I wanted to ask about some of your points at the end about societal decision making. So there are a lot of cases, of course, this is central to ethics, where the interests of the individual trade off somehow against the interests of the group. So everybody agrees to take some individual disadvantage for the good of the group. So you mentioned surveillance as one example.
Everybody doesn't agree to that.
Right. Well, this is what I was getting to.
Taxes.
So, yeah. So one example is that you just mentioned is surveillance. Another is my self-driving car might sacrifice me to save the 6 pedestrians. Right. Do I then buy that car? Do I have informed consent when I buy that car, either through the political process or through opting into highway system number 1, private highway system number 1 instead of private highway system number 2? So I wanted to ask specifically about a case in healthcare that I've thought about on and off, which is when the system decides, and when I say the system, I mean maybe a collaboration between the computer and a doctor, decides to give me a treatment. There are 2 reasons to give me that treatment. One is to cure me, and in reinforcement learning we call that exploitation. And the other is to learn what treatments work on whom. And in reinforcement learning we call that exploration. So a system that does some exploration and is always doing some amount of randomized trial when it's not sure. So it thinks treatment A is probably better, but it's not sure enough to give me treatment A. If I were the last patient on Earth, it would give me treatment A. But given that there are other patients in future, maybe it'll experiment on me with treatment B. So what's the thinking of the bioethics community at the moment on informed consent about entering into such a system? This is not the traditional system where I sign up for a randomized control trial or I don't.
Right.
Just by virtue of being a member of the Hopkins healthcare system, maybe I agree to this, but do I really understand what I'm agreeing to?
So the kind of thing that you're talking about sounds exactly like what we would call a pragmatic clinical trial. Okay. So, I mean, docs are making the decisions all the time, right? There are 2 drugs. They're basically equivalent, we think, but there's never been any large post-market trial. So I'm not sure. Today, our doc just, whoever gave him the pen or would ever, sense the doc has about which one she prescribes you that one. We're now doing something called pragmatic clinical trials, which is A/B testing, basically, right? Like, which of those is better? And we're still figuring out the ethics of that. So there's a large NIH-funded project called the Collaboratory that is doing tons of projects on pragmatic clinical trials. And at Hopkins, we did a piece on what kind of informed consent should be done for those kinds of trials. And we did focus groups and we did interviews with docs. And again, that's all just being developed. So I would imagine that implementation of AI in that kind of system the ethics would be governed by that kind of system, not necessarily by the fact that it was AI doing the randomization.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But you can see a debate or discussion which comes down on the side of saying that some degree of randomization, meaning within certain fair parameters, choosing to follow a treatment that is just a little bit less likely to succeed than another one is good in the interest of science, because if we always went with the slightly more efficacious one, we'd never find out what the other treatment does.
But keep in mind that our human subject protections came out of abuse, right? So abuse that did very serious damage to people, right? Like docs saying, I wonder if I inject these elderly people with cancer cells, if they'll get cancer. Like, bad, right? So we needed rules, and the rules that we developed came out of not only the original spur that was the revelations about the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? So we realized that there was a whistleblower who announced to the world that the Public Health Service, part of our federal government, was funding a study wherein poor black sharecroppers in Tuskegee, Alabama, who had syphilis, were not given treatment. And when the trial started, there was no treatment available. So it was a natural history study, basically. But once treatment became available, the U.S. federal government, withheld it from these men and watched them die of syphilis. And we actually went to great lengths to withhold treatment. Now, we didn't give the guys syphilis, although that's the sort of mythology around the trial. We actually went to Guatemala to give people venereal disease. That was the first NIH-funded study, was to go to Guatemala and give prisoners syphilis by getting prostitutes drunk and sleeping with them. True story. So the human subjects, that led, the Tuskegee syphilis study led to a national commission that led to the Belmont report, which said that the principles that should govern human subjects research are beneficence, justice, and autonomy. So our system was sort of built up around worst case scenario with treatments that could do serious damage to people. Pragmatic clinical trials are not that. Pragmatic clinical trials are, we have these two that we think are pretty close, but we don't know what's best for you. The only way to find that out is by doing randomized trials. So can we do that without the full human subject protection apparatus? And people are actually okay with notification and other kinds of less stringent consent for some of these trials. But again, we're still sort of figuring that out. Because like written consent for that, it doesn't make sense and it won't get the data you need. Yep.
This might come out a little trouble, but a bit of a history question. So things like this first NIH study, which we know is terrible, we now wouldn't do that, presumably, because there are checks in place like IRBs that govern it. Where did the notion of a modern IRB come from? Was it either scientists recognizing that what they were doing was wrong and then opting into a system that they created, or is it external from more of the politicians that viewed what the scientists were doing was wrong and then created? And I ask that in relation to now you pointed to these various different organizations that are coming together. Primarily, the people, the technologists doing the work themselves are forming kind of a mission statement, best practices, but this has no teeth. Mm-hmm. And so would we imagine, is basically that where the IRBs came from, that it was the scientists themselves having a mission statement that eventually got codified into laws? Or did something bad enough happen that people that knew nothing about the science came in and slapped them down with regulation?
So IRBs were external, but the RAC was scientists themselves. And that was the governance body that came out of the first Asilomar conference. Well, actually, it was the second Asilomar conference in 1975, where scientists themselves came together and said, recombinant DNA has some very serious potential risks. We don't have enough data yet to assess the probability or magnitude of those risks. So we're going to impose, they actually asked the federal government to regulate them. They asked for a body that became the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee to regulate the science while they figured out how safe or not it was. So that was a system, that was sort of the first system in the biological sciences that came from within. A more recent example of that came from the stem cell research community. So embryonic stem cells, you have to destroy human embryos to create human embryonic stem cells. There were no federal policies in the US governing this outside of the human subjects protections. So scientists went to the national academies and said, please develop guidance for us that we can follow, because we get that this is controversial and we want to be able to demonstrate that we're doing our best possible efforts to ensure that we're doing this appropriately. And while neither the RAC did have teeth, and it was associated, it was part of federal government, and so could be tied, for example, to federal funding. The guidelines that came out of the national academies had 0 teeth, and everyone in the US adopted them who was doing that kind of research. And eventually they became federal policy under President Obama. So it's happened multiple different ways. And I should say that the US is weird in multiple ways, including in that most of our federal science policy adheres only to federally funded research, not to privately funded research, which causes all sorts of problems for, I think, obvious reasons. Yep, you're welcome.
Thanks for Dr. Berman's talk. So my question is about the autonomy question you mentioned at the end. So some people like to call AI augmented intelligence, rather than artificial intelligence, right? So I can imagine rather than building an automated system to predict your disease, I could just give signals to a doctor who will then predict your disease. Now, are the ethical questions of that kind of system fundamentally different from a fully automated system, or is it more nuanced?
Both. I mean, it would be one of the an augmented intelligence system would be further away from full autonomy, right? And so the ethics would be a little bit different because the responsibility would still be with the physician to make the ultimate decision, right? Whether the physician takes that responsibility seriously or just takes whatever is given to it by the autonomous system is a question of ethics, but it's a question of ethics for the physician, not for the autonomous system.
I guess I'm asking more to say, as an engineer, can I actually skirt the question of ethics by saying, I'm just building something that the doctor will look at?
Right. Well, again, it still goes back to your data sets. And what data is your system being trained on? And how biased are those data? And are the recommendations that come out of that system going to systematically disadvantage certain groups of people in ways that they're already systematically disadvantaged? Yes?
Is there a way to ground those biases in the sense that we know that individuals have biases, and as a society or as a profession there are biases? Now let's assume that we have an AI that if we get everything right, if we collect the data properly, if we select the algorithms properly, we can build something that we believe is not biased. But is there a way, like I can estimate an error in a measurement in a physics experiment that I can systematically reduce biases and be absolutely certain that there's no biases anymore?
That is an excellent question. If you come up with that answer, I think you will be very rich.
So are you thinking, Florian, that we could have an implicit association test for our AI to make it do some of the task and see if it
performs better or worse than the imperfect agents that we are?
Right, so there is no good answer for that?
Well, I mean, it's an algorithmic question, right? I mean,
Is it? That seems too simple to me.
Are you asking if there's anything that we can do to prove to ourselves that AI hasn't imported all of our biases?
Yeah, I think that's it.
There is some work, actually. So some work that was done by Moritz Hart and Natty Schwebro and colleagues on doing statistical tests so I'm trying to remember. This is essentially related to causal inference.
I'm wondering how related is it? Can we use the existing tools that show us how good standard algorithms are? Can we apply it to AI and it should work just as well? Or
Well, the implicit bias test is not a bad idea, right?
I don't know how I'd design them, because humans, you can make them do different tasks
Right.
and measure the bias in that way. I don't know if these machines can be made to do other tasks than the one they're intended for in a way that will reveal their bias.
Right.
So, I mean, I really think through it. I don't have an idea. I just thought about it when you asked it.
But that itself, I mean, I think that goes to thinking about how to do that from the beginning, as opposed to producing the autonomous machine or bot or whatever it is, and then saying, okay, now I have this thing. How can I figure out if it's doing what I want it to do? If you, from the beginning, had in mind that you wanted to be able to test it in these particular ways, it would be much easier to do that as a matter of design than as a sort of aftermarket application.
So
at least within natural language processing, there is a fair amount of work lately in trying to come up with these diagnostic tests on small things to check different kinds of biases. Some of that work comes out of peer topics. The thing that I've been struggling with, and this gets to my earlier question, is there's been a lot of work within AI, which I would call finger pointing, like good, like well-intentioned, but saying, if you're wrong, you're wrong, I'm wrong. My previous result had bias, this has bias, this has bias. And we're starting to develop algorithms that can potentially try to the word debias is a hot topic this year. I'm trying to debias things. And maybe it's doing what you think it's doing, maybe it's not quite doing what you want. The big problem I've been having lately, talking about this with my students, is the last bullet you had on your slides of who actually gets to decide. And the idea of the engineers making these decisions makes me very nervous because I don't know enough about the world, and I know how this works. I don't really know much about the real world, and I don't really see the engagement from outside society in this, other than just saying, "Well, Google will figure it out." So, is there, besides these geeks getting together and writing a mission statement, do you see that there are actually more like real world policy experts that are starting to get engaged in this conversation?
So the European Commission just launched a group to do just that, in part at least. But as I mentioned, I mean, we're bad at public engagement. We haven't figured it out. The latest challenge in my world has been around CRISPR, right? Germline genetic modification, meaning introducing genetic changes in the genome that will be propagated to the next generation. And these are national and global conversations that we need to be having, and we don't have the methods to do it. We have the methods to do project level and maybe consortium level public engagement, where goals can actually be shifted in response to what's heard from stakeholders. But on national and global level questions, we don't have good methods for that, and it's unclear to me who would be the receptor, right? Who would be the individual or body that would take in that information and actually respond to it in substantive ways and shape their goals to align with that, right? I don't know who or what that would be other than like Google and Facebook, right? And
I'm quite worried that we're getting to a point where there's an increasingly frothy discussion on things that technologists are doing for fun.
Mm-hmm.
But just like you described these other branches of science where they went to say the National Academy and said, give us a policy. Like,
yeah.
Tell us what we're supposed to do and we'll follow that policy. And I'm not seeing that happen.
I mean, would the National Academy of Engineering be a place that you could go and ask for that?
I think the public will engage increasingly as AI systems do bad things.
Well, they'll engage.
Exactly. And it will be a sort of engagement by use case.
This is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. How dare you, how dare you.
Right.
Well,
and maybe up to engineers to figure out how to deal with those, but at least we'll be guided by use cases. I mean, it's like behavioral ethics, where we have all these ideas of particular dots. We know that this one's wrong and this one's right and so forth. And how do we write down a rule that captures where our values?
You're talking about like gender and sexual orientation and these sorts of things, which I mean, based on especially all the publicity around the Me Too movement, no scientist wants to be the one that gets slapped down for their one particular bad system, and the rest of the scientists say, "Oh, well, we learned a lesson. Now we'll avoid that particular conduct." You're talking about people's entire careers.
Well, I feel like
and bigger than that, right? I mean, at the Asimov conference, the AI version, Wendell Wallach said that he's very concerned that there's going to be sort of a GMO response to AI, right? That the entire field is going to be painted with this broad brush of malevolence, and it will really stymie things.
Yeah, I think that's like this reactionary, like when the public gets involved, the reaction amongst engineers is we don't want to touch that topic. Like I think that's what you see a lot of the industry. It's just like, let's just blacklist a ton of things. We're not going to speak about this issue. We're not going to run our system from this thing. So that's like long-term also not a good solution, because then you're just not doing research on these topics. So you're not fixing them. You're just like, we're not touching it. So it doesn't seem like waiting for public outcry and then saying, you're right, let's not do that thing is a long-term optimal
No, but that's what he was saying, I think, that the proactive thing to do is to go to the national academies or IEEE or whatever the appropriate, give us, I mean, go through a very deliberative, defensible process and develop some guidelines that we have to follow, right? And in a way that gets ahead of, at least if then something bad does happen, procedurally the field has made efforts to avoid that.
Not only that, but people know where to send their complaint. So they're not sending their complaint to the individual researcher, they're sending their complaint to the policy-making body that said that this experiment was okay. So that there's some democratic way of revising the social contract.
So Des has a question, but let me just make a comment. I think what's emerging from this is that we need to go to a body that both the engineers and the technologists respect and that society will respect as a reasonable body. It's not a body of people who are in the business to make money. So if you say, oh, Google, AI, Amazon have done this, I say, yeah, sure. What do they care other than making money? Right? So it has to be a body that doesn't have a dog in the fight, if you will, which all sides respect. But anyway, Des, you had a different question.
Earlier in your talk, you spoke about the idea of using AI to help with medical decisions, for example, prescribing treatments. I don't understand the US healthcare system. So
Join the club.
so this might be a bad question, but today, does a doctor need to explain to a patient how they reached a decision? Do they need to disclose, I'm recommending this drug because I had dinner with a company representative last week and I believe what they told me? And if the answer to that is no, in the future, why should a doctor have to disclose they used an AI system to help them make a decision? If we don't hold our current doctors to these standards, should we be thinking about also revising our current working practices instead of imagining this amazing future where everything is going to be solved?
First of all, I don't think that there is an amazing future where everything is solved. I mean, humans are always going to be involved, so there will always be problems. Today, docs usually don't disclose that, but they're supposed to disclose their decision making if the patient asks them. I mean, I think a big part of the problem is that, there are data that show that the most influential thing from pharma, it's not the pharma rep taking them out to dinner, it's the sticky notes that they left, or the pen. It's like the minima, the little tchotchkes are actually the things that influence docs most for whatever reason. So they're likely not even aware of the influence that that's having, right? They're like, oh, it's just a pen. It's a pen that you use every single day and see the name every single day, and so that's the one that comes to mind when you're making a prescription. So no, that disclosure is not happening, but that's not optimal. Right, and docs should be, as a scientist, when I'm publishing a paper, if my paper is on, the effects of sugar, and I'm funded by Diamond, what you call it? Domino. Thank you. The enormous sign downtown. And I'm funded by Domino, I have to disclose that. Right, and I actually have just submitted a paper to a cancer journal, and the amount of disclosures, I hadn't done that before, the amount of disclosures to publish in a cancer in an oncology journal is tremendous. Like, they want to know everything across multiple different kinds of conflicts. So in the research context, we absolutely have to disclose. There's a whole conflict of interest committee at Hopkins, and I have to take regular, training and stuff. In the context of care, it's these small things that influence that are harder to, we don't realize that they're actually influencing us.
Okay, go ahead.
So most of these discussions tend to be like, there's a broad umbrella term, AI covering many things, but do you think we should maybe, that's helpful, clearly there's a question of scale is a problem, just pattern matching even like in the lowest level can be problematic, and then there's actually autonomy and all that. So the ethics of these three seem very, very different.
Yeah.
But we always talk of them like we have conversations like this, which is like one person is thinking about the autonomy, and then there's also some issues about scale. This is that, like, how do we sort of negotiate this, or at least be aware that we're dealing with very different ideas and talking about ethics with all of them interacting in arbitrary ways?
Yeah, I mean, we have to get better at naming what it is we're actually talking about. The problem is that saying AI is so sexy right now that everyone wants to label everything they're doing as AI. And this happens every time there's an emerging technology, right? This happened with stem cells. Like there was suddenly stem cell face creams, right? That's like, what the hell? But that was like the sexy thing that was a marketing ploy. And scientists do it with their science too, right? We talk about like our science in the most sort of sexy, cutting edge way that we can, but it's a double-edged sword. Because then you've painted it with this broad brush that maybe everyone doesn't agree with that. And I think that's happening in AI, where we're not being very good at naming what it is we're talking about. And it's all being labeled as AI in the full autonomy sense, which in the vast majority of cases is not what we're talking about, and personally isn't a very interesting question to me because it's so futuristic. We have plenty of problems here that we can actually work on. So I think getting better at naming what it is we're talking about and explaining that to people, right? The general public gets super excited about AI too, generally. Like if I'm talking on a plane, so in the last year, it used to be the case, I'd say all the stuff that I work on, and folks wanted to talk about CRISPR. Before that, it was about stem cells. Now, I say all the stuff I do, and then I say AI at the end. They're like, oh my God, let's talk about that. Like, okay, that's what I know the least about. But sure, let's talk about that. Because that's sort of like the cool, exciting thing right now. I mean, Westworld, and what's the other one? I mean, it's in the public consciousness right now. So it's very easy to talk about what you're doing as AI as a hook, but then you need to walk it back and say, and here's what that actually means.
It's because when that happens, I feel like we're sort of compelled to do what like Ben was worried about. Like engineers again have more, like if I discuss implications of AI and then people think of Westworld, they're so not in the zip code that I am. And so it's like, or like as an engineer, let me deal with it myself. Like that would be my instinct.
But can you then take the next step and explain to them in terms they can understand why it's not Westworld?
Yeah.
And why it's still interesting even though it's not Westworld?
Right, yeah, that would be the hard part.
Yep.
You mentioned bias in data sets, which is very relevant for data-driven AI, and I think what we're current problem we're having is this trade-off between how to deal with the bias and overall performance of the system that we're training. And one of the issues is we have large, very expensive data sets that already include these biases. And I think there's sometimes a mentality, why would I sacrifice overall performance? But at the same time, technology that we're building on these data sets can systematically exclude certain classes of underprivileged people. And I think there's a bit of a parallel maybe from medicine in terms of the historical clinical trials that have been run in the past that excluded certain classes of people. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on anything that AI can learn from medical parallel or actual
Well, from a sort of practical perspective, we had a similar problem in genetics and genomics in that there is structure in large genetic data sets that can lead to spurious associations between mutation and disease. And that structure is based on human population history. Right? So we all came out of Africa. The human species originated in Africa, and every other population in the world is a small subset of the variation that exists in Africa. So your people of European extraction are much less genetically diverse than people of African extraction. because of the sort of evolutionary depth of those genomes. And because of those differences in variation, you can see sort of spurious associations between things. And we had to figure out algorithmically how to account for that underlying structure in the data so that we didn't get spurious associations. And this strikes me as a similar, bias strikes me as a similar sort of problem. There's this structure in the data that's a result of our biases that needs to be taken into account and put to the side so that the remaining, hopefully unbiased data can be computed on or learned from. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but I think it's an analogy that could be useful. Yep.
Yeah, no, keep going. The more you
Yeah,
call out.
so maybe an easy question in this field. What does it mean that something is, I mean, do we know what question are we ready to the machine? Because what does it mean that it's biased? In which sense it is biased, right? It's biased. Machines will never internalize morals by themselves, and that morals will come from data. So wouldn't it be important to know what question we're posing to the machine, and then after the question, knowing what's the question we're asking, rather than trying the machine to reflect our moral understanding of the world? It might never learn.
Well, no, it absolutely depends on what question the machine is being asked to answer, right? If it's a very straightforward question about, for example, I don't know, blood pressure, like numeric values, and you're only talking about numeric values, that might be less prone to bias than, for example, a question that relates to the narrative text in an electronic medical record.
But the bias could be a conflict between our moral understanding and the answer of the machine, because the moral understanding might be conflicted with the data itself, right? Yeah. What I mean is the machine could be biased because the data is very little, and it just gathers some low-hanging fruits and not being discriminated from racial ethnic group. Okay, but it might be that it's just there, like it's not part of the reality. It's just that we don't want a reality like this, and we say we don't accept that, right? So this is different because we're humans, and these are rules, and we're evolved the natural of doing things, right? And we want to change that. And that's a different thing. It's another level, right?
So for example, it might very well be the case that people from lower socioeconomic classes are less compliant with treatment X, and therefore, as I was saying before, from an economic perspective, you shouldn't give the treatment to the person because they're not going to be compliant anyways, and it's a waste of money. As a human, I would say we can't make that decision, right? We have to figure out what we can do to enable that person to benefit from this treatment. Is that what you're trying to get at?
It's a proper decoupling of the elements of the process.
Yes.
So the machine is tasked with a very particular thing that's in the decision process.
Yep.
And I think somehow we demand the machine to solve the entire thing. The machine would just solve the problem, and then we will act informed on that answer.
But the thing is, if I don't know that the reason I'm getting the answer I'm getting is because of low SES, and I think it's just the right answer that the machine is giving me, and the machine can't justify that answer to me, then I don't know to then impose my humanity on what to do in the face of that. Thanks.
So I want to know how close are these two groups, I mean the engineering group and the ethics groups right now, from your perspective? If they are really discussing these ethical issues right now, and also from my perspective, I'm going to the engineering part. The IE field is developing very, very fast, and somehow we don't have this knowledge of ethics, and we even don't know the final result. For example, in the dialogue system, that perhaps now the machine can reply to all of your questions, and for us that is amazing. But probably from your perspective, it's not that amazing. Are there any policies to prevent the engineering field to go into the wrong directions, or what is I don't know, the future, or what is the future, or the thing that we're working on this sense in the ethics?
I think that there is certainly not as much conversation happening between engineers and ethics and policy types as should be happening. I don't know honestly how much impact Partnership on AI or Future of Humanity Institute, I don't know what kind of traction they're getting in terms of changing or shaping what's happening in the field. I think that the possibility of going to the national academies or some independent party and saying, please give us some guidance that we can follow would be an excellent step to make. I mean, this frequently happens. Again, I've seen this happen across other emerging technologies where it happens really fast, and then we get so far into it and people say, oh, yeah, we need to actually, there's some problems here that we actually need to think about. And there's not necessarily a pause, but a moment where the field sort of realizes what's happening and starts to take concrete steps. I think, as I showed you, there are lots of initiatives around this. I don't know that they have teeth, and the field may be at the stage where it's time to think about some kind of guidance that would have more, at least gain more traction in the field in terms of shaping the goals of the work you're doing.
And in fact, I would say that part of the reason we are having this conversation is that we want to increase this engagement of engineers and technologists with ethicists. We don't want a Hiroshima or a Tuskegee experiment to happen which then says, oh my God, we've gone too far, we need to back out. I'm very happy about all this discussion, but we also have some constraints on time. So what I'd like to do is encourage you all to continue this discussion over the next hour, because the plan now is to go out and have lunch. Lunch is served right outside. And Professor Mathews will be here for another hour. All of you are here. Let's continue this discussion. And for the people in the summer workshop, at 1 o'clock, we come back into this room and continue with our progress report for the first year. Right? So again, thanks to especially the benefits. Let's continue to